Chapter 5 Before the Dark. In all, Susanna had probably met her maternal grandmother less than a dozen times. Even as a child, before she'd fully understand the words, she'd been taught that the old woman was not to be trusted, though she could not remember ever hearing a reason offered as to why. The mud had stuck, however. Though in her early adulthood, she was now 24, she had learned to view her parents' prejudices with a critical eye and come to suspect that whatever their anxiety regarding her grandmother, it was likely to be perfectly irrational. She could nevertheless not entirely forget the mythology that had grown up around Mimi Leszczynski. The very name was a stumbling block. To the ear of a child, it sounded more like a fairy tale curse than a name. And indeed, there had been much about the woman that supported such a fiction. Susanna remembered Mimi as being small, with skin that was always slightly jaundiced, her black hair, which with hindsight was probably dyed, drawn back tightly from a face which she doubted capable of a smile. Perhaps Mimi had reason for grief. Her first husband, who had been some sort of circus performer, had disappeared before the Great War. Run away, the family gossip went, because Mimi was such a harridan. The second husband, Susanna's grandfather, had died of lung cancer in his early 40s, smoked himself to death. Since then, the old woman had lived in increasingly eccentric isolation, alienated from her children and grandchildren alike in a house in Liverpool, a house to which, at Mimi's enigmatic request, Susanna was about to pay a long-delayed visit. As she drove north, she turned over her memories of Mimi and of that house. She recalled it being substantially larger than her parents' place in Bristol had been, and darker. A house that had not been painted since before the flood. A stale house. A house in mourning. And the more she remembered, the gloomier she became. In the private storybook of her head, this trip back to Mimi's was a return to the mire of childhood. A reminder not of blissful, careless years, but of an anxious, blinkered state from which adulthood had liberated her. And Liverpool had been that state's metropolis, a city of perpetual dusk, where the air smelt of cold smoke and a colder river. When she thought of it, she was a child again, and frightened of dreams. Of course, she'd shrugged off those fears years ago. Here she was, at the wheel of her car, perfect mistress of herself, driving in a fast lane with the sun on her face. What hold could those old anxieties have over her now? Yet, as she drove, she found herself drawing to her keepsakes from her present life, like talismans to keep that city at bay. She thought of the studio she'd left behind in London, and the pots she'd left to be glazed and fired when, in just a little while, she got back. She remembered Finnegan and the flirtatious dinner she'd had with him 2 nights ago, She thought of her friends, robust and articulate people, any of a dozen of whom she'd trust her life and sanity to, with so much clarity to arm her. She could surely retread the paths of her childhood and remain untainted. She traveled a broader, brighter highway now. Yet the memories were still potent. Some, like her picturing of Mimi and the house, were images she'd recalled before. One in particular, however, emerged from some hidden niche in her head, unvisited since the day she'd sealed it up there. The episode didn't come, as many had, piece by piece. It flashed before her all at once, in astonishing particularity. She was 6. They were in Mimi's house, she and her mother, and it was November. Wasn't it always? Drear and cold. They'd come on one of the rare visits to Grandma, a duty which Father had always been spared. She saw Mimi now, sitting in an armchair near to a fire that barely warmed the soot on the grate. Her face, soured and sad to the brink of tragedy, was pale with powder, the brows meticulously plucked, the eyes glittering even in the dour light through the lace curtains. She spoke, and her soft syllables drowned out the din of the motorway. Susanna. Addressed from the past, she listened. I've something for you. The child's heart had fallen from its place and thumped around in her belly. Say thank you, Susie, her mother chided. The child did as she was told. It's upstairs, Mimi said, in my bedroom. You can go and get it for yourself, can't you? It's all wrapped up at the bottom of the tall boy. Go on, Susie. She felt her mother's hand on her arm, pushing her away towards the door. Hurry up now. She glanced at her mother, then back at Mimi. There was no mercy to be had from either. They would have her up those stairs, and no protest would mellow them. She left the room and went to the bottom of the stairs. They were a mountain face before her, and the darkness at the summit a terror she tried not to contemplate. In any other house, she would not have been so fearful, but this was Mimi's house, Mimi's darkness. She climbed, her hand clinging to the banister, certain that something terrible awaited her on every stair. But she reached the top without being devoured, and crossed the landing to her grandmother's bedroom. The drapes were barely parted. What little light fell between was the color of old stone. A clock ticked on the mantelpiece at a quarter the speed of her pulse. On the wall above the clock, gazing down the length of the head-high bed, was an oval portrait photograph of a man in a suit that was buttoned up to the neck, and to the left of the mantelpiece, across a carpet that killed her footsteps, was the tall boy, twice her size and more. She went to it quickly, determined, now that she was in the room, to do the deed and be out before the ticking had its way with her and slowed her heart till it stopped. Reaching up, she turned the chilly handle. The door opened a little. From inside bloomed the smell of mothballs, shoe leather, and lavender water. Ignoring the gowns that hung in the shadows, she plunged her hand amongst the boxes and tissue paper at the bottom of the tall boy, hoping to chance upon the present. In her haste she pushed the door wide, and something wild-eyed lurched out of the darkness towards her. She screamed. It mocked her, screaming back in her face. Then she was running towards the door, tripping on the carpet in her flight before hurtling down the stairs. Her mother was in the hallway. "What is it, Susie?" There were no words to tell. Instead, she threw herself into her mother's arms. Though, as ever, there was that moment when they seemed to hesitate before choosing to hold her, and sobbed that she wanted to go home. Nor would she be placated, even after Mimi had gone upstairs and returned, saying something about the mirror in the tall boy door. They'd left the house soon after that, and, as far as she could now recall, Susanna had never since entered Mimi's bedroom. As for the gift, it had not been mentioned again. That was the bare bones of the memory, but there was much else. Perfumes, sounds, nuances of light that fleshed those bones. The incident, once exhumed, had more authority than events both more recent and ostensibly more significant. She could not now conjure, nor would ever she expected, the face of the boy to whom she'd given her virginity, but she could remember the smell from Mimi's tall boy as though it were still in her lungs. Memory was so strange, and stranger still the letter, at the beck of which she was making this journey. It was the first missive she'd received from her grandmother for over a decade. That fact alone would have been sufficient to have her forsake the studio and come, but the message itself, spindly crawlings on an airmail paper page, had lent her further speed. She'd left London as soon as the summons had arrived, as if she'd known and loved the woman who'd written it for 100 years. "Susanna," it had begun, not dear nor dearest, simply, "Susanna, forgive my scribbles. I'm sick at the moment. I feel weak some hours, and not so weak others. Who knows how I'll feel tomorrow? That's why I'm writing to you now, Susanna, because I'm afraid of what may happen. Will you come to see me at the house? We have very much to say to each other, I think. Things I didn't want to say, but now I have to. None of this will make much sense to you, I know, but I can't be plain, not in a letter. There are good reasons. Please come. Things are different to the way I thought they'd be. We can talk the way we should have talked many years ago. My love to you, Susanna. Mimi." The letter was like a midsummer lake, its surface placid, but beneath, such darkness. "Things are different to the way I thought they'd be," Mimi had written. What did she mean? That life was over too soon, and her sunlit youth had contained no clue as to how bitter mortality would be? The letter had been delayed, though the vagaries of postal service, by over a week. When, upon getting it, she'd rung Mimi's house, she'd received only the number disconnected tone, leaving the pots she was making unfinished. She had packed a bag and driven north. She went straight to Rue Street, but number 18 was empty. 16 was also deserted, but at the next house, a florid woman by the name of Violet Pumphrey was able to offer some explanation. Mimi had fallen sick a few days earlier and was now in Sefton General Hospital, close to death. Her creditors, which included the gas and electric city boards and the council, in addition to a dozen suppliers of food and drink, had immediately made moves to claim some recompense. Like vultures they were, said Miss Pumphrey, and her not even dead yet. It's shameful. There they were, taking everything they could lay their hands on. Mind you, she was difficult. Hope you don't mind my being plain, love, but she was. Kept herself hidden away in the house most of the time. It was a bloody fortress. That's why they waited, see? Till she was pegging out. If they tried to get in with her there, they'd have still been trying. Had they taken the tall boy? Susanna idly wondered. Thanking Miss Pumphrey for her help, she went back to have another look at number 18. Its roof so covered in bird shit it looked to have its own private blizzard. Then went on to the hospital.